So now we have Otto Dix, and he's a machine gunner and aerial observer during the war. So he actually serves in the German military. As a machine gunner, he's watching bodies pile up in front of him. Horrific scenes as he watches those rounds go out into no man's land. As an aerial observer, he has an unusual perspective, being able to fly over no man's land and see the destruction on either side as he calls back artillery positions or generally spies on what's going on. Now, he has perhaps been more influential than any other German painter in shaping our image of the Weimar Republic, artistically speaking, of the 1920s. And he's particularly key because during the height of his career, he paints nudes, prostitutes, and savagely satirical portraits of celebrities, as well as these haunting images of veterans and crippled soldiers. So he's kind of lashing out at all parts of society at once. His work became even darker and more allegorical in the 1930s, as he became a target of the Nazis for obvious reasons. They don't like the idea of depicting images that might turn people against the ideas of war. In response, he gradually moves away from social themes, turning to landscape and Christian subjects. And after serving in the army during World War II, enjoyed some considerable acclaim in his later years, so he's forced to go back in World War II. So, let's talk about a couple of his best-known pieces. First, Der Krieg. And this captures the devastation of the war, both on the terrain and on the human occupants. It's based on sketches and watercolors done at the front. That was actually really common. There's a lot of downtime for these soldiers when they're not going over the top or whatever else is happening. And so we see a lot of painting going on, especially watercolor painting of postcards, which would be painted and then sent back home. And what he's done is he's created a triptych. Now, usually we would think of these multiple panel pieces, which are triptychs, as a religious piece like this, where we would see some kind of story usually related to the ideas of salvation. Instead, we have no hope for salvation. Only death and decay await the proud soldier. The idea in all these works is the brutality and insanity of war, although they also wanted to remind the German people of the horrors, so such things hopefully would not happen again. His shockingly realistic depictions of wounded and dead soldiers in the trenches may have imprinted in our collective memory, which is really what he was shooting for, had that collective memory worked and reminded us of how horrific the war was before we got into World War II and the wars after. The huge triptych, Der Krieg, is one of the key works of German realist painting from the 20th century. So let's look at it a little bit deeper. In the style of an old master, the four panels reveal the great seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. And remember, in 1929 to 32, this is the great catastrophe, World War I. World War II hasn't happened. So here, we see the soldiers setting off at daybreak. You can imagine the patriotic songs. We almost see a flag in the clouds above. This really remarkable image. So we've got this almost flag-like image here with the heavy verticals. Obviously, they're clouds, not flags. Everyone goes out with all the right gear. They're proud. They're pleased. They've got everything. You can imagine them going out optimistically. We're going to change the way the war is being fought. We will be the ones who win the war. And we see this almost unlimited number of soldiers going back into the distance, as well as the ones up front here who are going into the trenches here. So from there, we see the battlefield. And this is a place of death. And it looks unreal. It looks sci-fi, or it's hard to describe. And the thing is, it's pretty real from the historical accounts. So he's trying to horrify you. And that's exactly what you should be feeling. We start with this soldier here. With the gas mask, we don't know if he's dead or alive. There's no way of knowing because we don't see his face or any part of his body. Although this mark in his helmet indicates he might well have been shot through. We see this body, this angel of death body up above. That angel of death is actually pretty realistic. You would have a shell that would explode. It would blow someone upwards. They would be caught in a tree or ruins. And they would just be left there because it's too dangerous to bring them down. If you go out to try and bring them down, you'll probably be shot by a machine gunner or sniper or someone from the opposing trench. On the right side, we see all of these bodies, and people, in my experience, look at this and go, come on, that's absolutely ridiculous. They would do what we're told people do in war, which is they would take the bodies away and they would bury them and they would have, a truce for a couple of hours to do this. That doesn't happen in World War I. In fact, the bodies simply sit out there in no man's land or even in the trench because you can imagine your buddy puts his head up a little too high and gets caught by a sniper's round. And that body will now sit there. And what makes it worse is the bodies will be out in no man's land. They'll be buried slowly by dirt thrown up by artillery shells or whatever else. And then a few years later, because remember, trench warfare is going on for over 3 years. But years later, suddenly the right place round might throw up parts of your buddy again. And suddenly you have these bodies sitting there. And sometimes you'll have bodies obviously sitting there, like the legs. And you're just going to shoot right through them because it's like anything else on no man's land. It's in your way. So you're going to shoot at it to try and cut it down. This is disturbing, and again, it's meant to be. There is no hope. There is no salvation. There is no survival. In one of the final panels, as we move off to the right, we see a soldier appearing to return from the hell of battle, but this may well be Otto Dix depicting himself. The idea that no matter what you do, no matter how heroic you are, it doesn't matter, it won't help. Because look at the figure he's carrying. You see the man in white looking towards us. That might be Dix. The figure he's carrying is pretty clearly dead. It's a hopeless situation. There is no positive. In fact, that red inferno in the background has been suggested to mean hell itself, as if all the soldiers, just for having participated, are going to go to hell. There is no innocence. There is no one going to heaven. There is no one getting out of this alive. But it gets worse because below we have an image of the dugout. So-called peace in the dugout. Now, a dugout is a bunker dug into the ground, low down in the trench. The idea being we're going to dig it in, and hopefully if a shell lands, unless it's a direct hit, you'll be fine. It's a place to rest and sleep. Because if you're in the trench, it's too risky to sleep. So, we have these dugouts, but the problem is when you really look at it, those figures don't look alive. They look dead. Looks like a large common coffin. And in fact, that often happened. So, these dugouts are usually maybe 6 feet wide, just long enough for people to generally lay down. And then you would have 5 or 10 people deep. And they would go in there to sleep, but what often happened is you would have a shelling take place, and suddenly the dugout is buried. The entrance to it is buried, and so you're left basically buried alive with 5 other people or 10 other people. Imagine the horror of that. You're not just alone dying, you're listening to everyone else die around you, and you're so tightly packed and the space is so small, there's no way for you to even think about or try to get out. And he does other pieces. This is Trench. This is a very famous piece. It's thought to be a lost piece, where we see many of the same ideas as we do in that central panel. He's trying to show the public, the civilians, who would have never seen the trenches, much less seen the war in the trenches, the fighting in the trenches. He's trying to show them what it's really like, so that when they think about war, they think about the trenches and these images and say, no, that is not acceptable under any circumstance. Now, he's also going to talk about what Germany is like after the war. with Prager Street. And this is an honest look at the horrors of war, even after the war is over. So on the left there, you see the trenches with bodies piled up. That's the image that Dix wants us to see of the war. On the right is Prager Street. And what you'll notice is everything has to do with prosthetics. We have a man who seems to be half a man without any legs at the bottom. Here we have someone with a cane. Here we see a man who's missing 2 legs and an arm. Here we see a prosthetic shop at the top. We see all of these images referring to prosthetics. And prosthetics are a big deal in Germany following World War I. There's so many injured that they really do redevelop the entire industry of prosthetics. And so that's what we're seeing. That's why he's capturing here in Prager Street. This is an idea that the veterans and the people who have gone through the war are the victims. There are, again, no heroes. There is no one who is left without injury due to the war. And as you look at it more and more, the more sad it gets. I mean, look, we've got this arm here that looks like it's made up of a glove. It's not human, which means it must be prosthetic. We have all sorts of imagery. The more you look at it, the more you see bits that give us that sense of injury. Not injury to an individual, but to an entire society. This is him screaming at the top of his lungs how horrific the experience has been and how much the German people should avoid getting back into it. But of course we know what's going to happen. And we know that we're going to see World War II. And sadly, World War II will not be the shock for the Europeans that World War I was. And yet, as we continue forward, we're going to keep dealing with World War I. Because we need to deal with Dada and their look at the war.